They thought she was just another black woman they could humiliate at the checkpoint. They laughed as they trashed her bag, tossing out her things with no respect. But when they found a small emblem hidden inside, everything stopped. Faces went pale, voices fell silent, and they realized they had just crossed a line they could never step back from. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching us from. Amara Hill woke before the morning had a chance to break. It was not the alarm clock that pulled her from the ragged edges of a shallow sleep, but the familiar ache in her knee and the quiet command that had lived inside her since the first time she'd worn a uniform. She lay still for a moment, listening to the hum of the old ceiling fan, the whisper of wind against the narrow window, the sigh of her own breath in the room that smelled faintly of laundry detergent and the older wood of her dresser. Outside, the streetlight cast long stripes across the cracked paint of the wall, reminding her that dawn was near, but not yet arrived. She moved carefully, each motion deliberate, feeling the tightness in the tendons of her shoulder as she rotated her arm before sitting up. Her feet found the floor, the cold tile sending a shiver up her spine that helped clear the fog of sleep from her mind. She dressed in the quiet, pulling on a simple gray t-shirt, the fabric soft from age, and dark work pants she had ironed the evening before. Her hands, strong and steady, smoothed over her thighs as she tucked in the shirt, noting the thin scars that ran across her forearms, pale against her dark skin, each a reminder of moments she no longer allowed herself to relive in detail. In the small bathroom, she washed her face, the water cold enough to sting, and met her reflection without hesitation. Her hair was cropped short, practical, with a single streak of gray that traced from her temple like a quiet confession she never spoke aloud. The lines around her mouth had deepened over the years. The small furrow between her brows had settled in like a shadow she carried, a part of her expression whether she was smiling or not. She touched her cheek once, a feather-light touch that was neither affectionate nor critical, just a brief acknowledgement that she was here, alive, moving into another day. The kitchen was as quiet as the rest of the small home. She turned on the coffee pot, the machine gurgling softly as it came to life, filling the air with the sharp scent of brewing coffee that cut through the lingering silence. She poured oatmeal into a bowl, the last scoop from a bag she had folded tightly to keep it from going stale. She added water, stirred, and placed it in the microwave. The hum filling the space as she leaned against the counter, letting her mind settle into the routine she had built carefully, like walls around herself. When the microwave beeped, she removed the bowl and set it on the table, adding a splash of the coffee to thin it, stirring the mixture until it was the right consistency. She sat, spoon in hand, and began to eat slowly, each bite mechanical, necessary, but tasting of little. She did not add sugar, knowing well what sugar could do, how the smallest trigger could bring back flashes of memory so sharp they carved into her mind like glass. She needed the morning to remain empty, a blank page she could write her silence upon. Outside, the sky began to pale, the thin light of dawn pushing at the edges of darkness. She rinsed the bowl, placed it carefully on the drying rack, and took her keys from the hook near the door. The old sedan in the driveway greeted her with a soft groan as she opened the door, the fabric seats holding the chill of the morning air. She started the engine, letting it idle for a moment before backing out, the tires crunching softly on the gravel, the sound oddly comforting in the quiet street. The drive to the base was familiar, each turn and stop sign committed to muscle memory. She passed the same houses, some with lights already on, others still dark, the silhouettes of trees against the slowly lightening sky. The road stretched ahead, a thin gray ribbon leading her toward the place where she would spend the next 10 hours moving paperwork and confirming supply codes, pretending that the world outside her mind was enough. Other cars passed her, newer models, shining clean in the early light, driven by young men with close-cropped hair and women with carefully styled buns and fresh makeup. They did not look at her as they passed, their eyes fixed ahead or on the glowing screens of their dashboards, their lives rushing forward with the certainty of those who believed in tomorrow. Amara kept her eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel, breathing evenly as she moved forward, unhurried, unseen. At the gate, the guard glanced at her ID, his eyes sliding over her without pausing, and waved her through with a casual flick of his wrist. She nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement, and drove on, parking in the farthest row where the older vehicles lined up, their faded paint and dents a quiet testament to those who drove them. She turned off the engine, sitting for a moment as the silence filled the car, before opening the door and stepping out into the cool air, the scent of fuel and dust greeting her like an old acquaintance. The walk to the logistics building took her past hangars and service roads, past the radar dishes that stood angled like silent sentinels against the sky. She moved with purpose, but without rush, her boots striking the pavement with soft, steady sounds. She greeted those she passed with a nod, receiving in return brief looks, some polite, some dismissive, most indifferent. She was used to it, the way her presence barely rippled the surface of the world around her, how her existence here was noted only in passing, a name on a shift list, a signature on a form, a shadow in the corner of a room. Inside the building, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the pale green walls reflecting their sterile glow. The smell of coffee, paper, and the faint chemical tang of cleaning supplies hung in the air. She moved through the hallway, past doors with labels that marked offices and storage rooms, each one a small world of its own, where people worked and whispered and lived out their days in the steady rhythm of bureaucracy. Her office was small, a rectangle with one window that looked out onto the service alley where the trash trucks came before dawn. She preferred it that way, the quiet of the alley, the monotony of the view, the way it allowed her mind to settle into the work without distraction. She placed her bag carefully beside her chair, taking out her badge and the small notebook she used for tracking supply requests, setting them neatly on the desk before sitting down. The day began as it always did, with the glow of the computer screen coming to life, the hum of the fan inside it blending with the background noise of the building. She logged in, her fingers moving across the keys with practiced ease, pulling up spreadsheets and tracking numbers, matching requests with inventory, signing off on deliveries of hydraulic seals, compressor blades, fuel additives, all the parts that kept the machines of the base running. It was work that required precision but not thought, a kind of mechanical focus that allowed her to remain present without being truly engaged. People came and went, dropping off forms, asking brief questions, making small jokes that she met with a polite nod or a short reply. They called her Hill or Miss Hill, the formality a thin veneer over the reality that, to most, she was invisible, a part of the background noise of the logistics machine they barely noticed. Sometimes she heard the laughter after she turned away, the quiet comments about how she always kept to herself, how she never smiled, how she thought she was better than everyone else because she didn't join in the small talk, the jokes, the gossip. At lunch, she sat alone at the corner of the break room, her oatmeal in a small container, black coffee in a thermal cup, while the others gathered at the larger tables, laughing and trading stories about weekend plans, promotions, the latest gossip about who was sleeping with whom. She kept her eyes on the small screen of her tablet, scrolling through inventory lists, pretending to read as she ate, letting the noise wash over her without sinking in. Once, she glanced up and saw a young woman, new, sitting at another small table, looking down at her food as the others laughed about something she had said earlier in the day. Their eyes met for a moment, and Amara saw it there, the tightness in the young woman's jaw, the forced stillness in her shoulders, the careful silence that came from learning too quickly what was safe to say and what was not. She looked away, finishing her lunch without another glance, but the image stayed with her. The afternoon passed in the slow, steady rhythm of work. Papers moved from one pile to another, emails answered, calls taken, data entered. Outside the window, the light shifted, the sun climbing high and then beginning its slow descent, the shadows lengthening in the alley, the trash trucks returning for the last pickups of the day. Amara continued her work, each keystroke a small act of endurance, a way to keep the world in order, to keep herself from slipping into the memories that sometimes threatened at the edges of her mind. When the end of the day came, she shut down her computer, locking the drawers, aligning the files on her desk. She picked up her bag, checking to make sure everything was in its place, the old habit of preparation, of readiness, never fully leaving her. She left the office as she had found it, quiet, orderly, a space that could have belonged to anyone. Outside, the air was cooler, the light softer as the sun dipped toward the horizon. She walked back to her car, the sound of her boots on the pavement steady, grounding. Other workers passed her, some in groups, some alone, their conversations trailing in the air, fading as she walked past. She unlocked the car, sliding into the driver's seat, the fabric warm from the afternoon sun. As she started the engine, she let herself breathe, letting the tension ease from her shoulders, the careful mask of neutrality slipping just a fraction. She drove home as the sky shifted from pale blue to the warm colors of sunset. The streetlights flicker into life as she turned onto her street, the small houses lining the road in quiet rows. Inside her home, she placed her bag on the chair, moving through the small space with the ease of habit. She changed into comfortable clothes, folding her work clothes neatly for the next day. In the kitchen, she prepared a simple dinner, the motions calming, the familiar scents grounding her in the present. Later, she sat in the small living room, the lights dim, the sounds of the neighborhood soft outside her window. She reached into her bag, her fingers finding the small metal emblem that she kept tucked away in a hidden pocket, pulling it out and holding it in the palm of her hand. The black griffin, its wings spread, the 3 lightning bolts clutched in its claws, the surface cool against her skin. She looked at it, the memories stirring, the nights under foreign skies, the moments when she had been more than a shadow in a logistics office, when she had been someone others depended on, when her decisions had meant the difference between life and death. She closed her hand around the emblem, her eyes closing for a moment, the weight of it grounding her, reminding her that she was still here, that she had survived. She placed it back in the hidden pocket, zipping it closed, locking it away once more. She turned off the lights, the house settling into the quiet of the night, the shadows deepening as she lay in bed, listening to the hum of the ceiling fan, the distant sounds of cars on the road, the soft whisper of her own breath. She closed her eyes, letting the darkness settle around her, the image of the emblem lingering in her mind. The black griffin, a silent promise that she would rise again, that she would face whatever came as she always had, with steady hands and a quiet heart, moving through the world unseen, but unbroken, ready for whatever the dawn might bring. Amara awoke before the alarm, though this time she did not rise immediately. She lay still, her hand resting on the hidden pocket of her bag that she had placed beside her bed the previous night. The memory of the emblem's cool weight against her palm lingered, an echo in the darkness, reminding her of the part of herself she had spent years burying beneath schedules and serial numbers. Outside, the pre-dawn sky was a deep blue, the first threads of light just beginning to pull at the edges of the horizon, while the neighborhood remained hushed, street lights casting their cones of yellow over quiet asphalt. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the calm before the day settle around her before she rose, her motions precise and silent, dressing in the same uniform she had worn yesterday, folding the lines and tucking the edges as though the act alone could keep the day orderly. The drive to the base felt the same as every morning, the rumble of the engine, the soft vibration of the road beneath the tires, the landscape rolling past in the dim light. Houses passed, fences and yards, the flicker of televisions behind curtained windows, the early risers pulling garbage bins to the curb. She watched without seeing, her mind turning quietly around the shape of the emblem, the way it had felt alive in her hand, the way it had made the small, ordered world she had built feel fragile, temporary. She breathed in through her nose, steadying herself, pushing the thought down where it could not interfere with the routine of the day. At the base, the parking lot was already filling, rows of cars lined up in the gray dawn, headlights cutting through the morning fog. She parked as always in the farthest row, shutting off the engine and sitting for a moment as the warmth of the drive began to seep from the cabin, replaced by the chill of the morning air pressing against the glass. She adjusted her badge, checked the contents of her bag, her hand brushing the hidden pocket, the metal within it a quiet presence. She stepped out, locking the door, her boots crunching on the gravel as she joined the flow of people heading toward the building. Today, however, the flow was redirected. A failure in the main scanner at the primary entrance had forced all personnel to reroute through the west checkpoint, the one typically reserved for flight crews and munitions convoys, a place where the guards watched with eyes sharp and hungry for power, a place where the procedures were stricter, the inspections more invasive, and the air hummed with the tension of authority pressed tight against those who had no power to resist it. She felt it immediately, the way the air thickened with the edge of authority, the way people shifted uncomfortably in line, eyes down, shoulders tight, as the guards barked orders, pulling aside bags, demanding papers, inspecting each person with suspicion disguised as procedure. Amara took her place in the line, the weight of her bag against her shoulder a reminder with every step forward. The line snaked back and forth, a long, restless coil of bodies shifting and shuffling under the cold eye of the guards. She kept her gaze forward, breathing steadily, counting her breaths to keep her mind still, her pulse steady. Ahead of her, a young woman adjusted the collar of her uniform, glancing nervously at the guards, while a pair of technicians behind Amara whispered jokes about the women in line, their laughter sharp, cutting through the hum of conversation. Pulling a tightness into her shoulders she forced herself to release. The guards watched the line with the casual cruelty of those who enjoyed their small dominion, their mirrored sunglasses reflecting the faces of those they inspected, their hands quick and practiced as they rifled through bags, turning out pockets, pulling apart carefully packed lunches and personal belongings, searching for contraband or simply asserting their presence. Amara felt their eyes move over her, pausing, assessing, moving on, only to return again as she stepped forward in the line, closer to the checkpoint, closer to the tables where the guards waited with gloved hands and hard eyes. She stepped forward when called, placing her bag on the steel table, her hands flat against her thighs, her eyes fixed on the wall just beyond the checkpoint, a small point of focus to steady herself as the guard reached for her bag. His gloves creaked softly as he unzipped it, pulling open the compartments, lifting out her belongings one by one, placing them on the table with a series of small, deliberate sounds that seemed louder in the quiet that had settled around them. Her thermos, her notebook, her small pouch of toiletries, the folded cotton t-shirt she kept for emergencies, the packet of oatmeal she carried for days when the cafeteria food was too heavy, each item placed with the careful disinterest of someone performing a ritual they found both tedious and necessary. She heard the small laughs of the technicians behind her as the guard lifted her hairbrush, a cracked plastic handle worn smooth by years of use, and turned it over in his hands before setting it down. Another guard leaned in, saying something she could not hear, his eyes flicking to her, then back to the items on the table, his mouth twisting in a small smirk. She remained still, her face calm, the mask she had perfected over years of practice holding firm, even as she felt the flush of heat at the back of her neck, the familiar spark of anger she kept banked behind the walls she had built inside herself. The guard reached into the final compartment of her bag, his hand moving slowly, deliberately, searching, and Amara felt the shift in the air before she saw it, the way the small, practiced movements of the inspection paused, hesitated, then resumed with a new care, a new attention. His hand emerged, holding the small leather case, the one she kept tucked away, the one she rarely touched, the one that held the emblem she had tried to forget. He turned it over, his brow furrowing as he looked at it, his fingers finding the clasp, flipping it open, and the emblem slid out, catching the overhead light with a brief, sharp glint as it landed on the steel table with a soft, final sound. The world seemed to stop for a moment, the soft hum of the ventilation system loud in the sudden silence that fell over the checkpoint. The laughter behind her died, replaced by the shuffling of feet, the sudden, uneasy cough of someone trying to clear their throat. The guard stared at the emblem, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights, his eyes locked onto the black griffin, its wings spread, the lightning bolts clutched in its claws, the symbol that should not have existed here, should not have been seen, should not have been found. Amara felt the change, the way the air thickened, the way the guards straightened, their eyes flicking to one another, to the emblem, to her, their hands shifting toward the radios clipped to their shoulders. She kept her face still, her breath steady, even as her heart thudded hard in her chest, the sound loud in her ears, each beat a reminder that the life she had built, the quiet she had claimed, was cracking open beneath the weight of a past she had carried hidden for too long. One of the guards stepped forward, his hand reaching for the radio, his voice low but urgent as he spoke into it, words she could not hear but felt in the way the checkpoint seemed to draw in on itself, the way the other guards began to move, closing ranks, their eyes on her, their hands near their weapons, the tension vibrating through the air like a live wire. The technician, who had laughed earlier, shifted backward, his eyes wide, his mouth opening as if to speak, then closing again as he stepped away, his gaze locked on the emblem that lay on the table, small but impossibly heavy. Amara's eyes flicked to the emblem, its dark surface reflecting the harsh light, the edges sharp, the image clear, a symbol that meant clearance beyond clearance, authority that surpassed the small power plays of the men around her, a ghost from a past that had never truly let her go. She felt the weight of it pressing against her, a silent demand that she acknowledge what it meant, what it had always meant, what it would mean now that it had been seen. A guard reached for the emblem, then stopped, his hand hovering over it, as though it might burn him to touch it. His eyes flicking to her, seeking something in her face, an explanation, a denial, something to make sense of the breach that had just opened in the orderly routine of the day. Amara kept her gaze steady, her breath slow, her face unreadable, even as inside the quiet she had cultivated fractured, the past rising like a tide, cold and inexorable, reminding her that silence was never as complete as she had once believed. She heard the distant sound of a vehicle approaching, the screech of tires against the asphalt, doors opening, the heavy steps of boots on concrete as figures approached, their presence pulling the attention of the guards, drawing their eyes away from her for a moment, the tension shifting as the newcomers arrived. She turned her head slightly, just enough to see the dark SUV, the men in plain clothes stepping out, their movements precise, controlled, the weight of authority in every step as they approached the checkpoint. They did not look at the guards as they passed, their eyes fixed on the emblem, on her, the air around them charged with the unspoken knowledge that whatever had been hidden was now exposed. Whatever had been silent was now heard. One of them picked up the emblem, holding it up to the light, turning it slowly, his eyes narrowing as he studied it before shifting his gaze to Amara, his expression unreadable, but his focus absolute. In that moment, Amara understood that the small crack in her carefully constructed life was opening wider, that the silence she had relied upon was gone, replaced by the low hum of something older, something deeper, rising up from the past to claim her once more. She stood still, her hands at her sides, her shoulders straight, as the man lowered the emblem, his eyes still on hers, and she knew that whatever came next, the quiet days of oatmeal breakfasts and unremarkable afternoons were over. And as the guards stepped back, as the air shifted around her, as the emblem was placed carefully back on the table, she felt the first edge of what was coming, the weight of it pressing against her, demanding her to remember, demanding her to stand, demanding her to acknowledge that silence, no matter how carefully kept, can never remain unbroken forever. They led Amara down a narrow hallway lined with security cameras and walls painted in a color that could never decide between green or gray. The air was dry and cool, humming with the electricity coursing through cables hidden behind the walls, and with every step, the world she had tried to build around herself seemed to recede further, replaced by the low, steady drum of boots on tile and the hollow echo that followed in their wake. She kept her gaze forward, her shoulders squared, moving with a controlled calm that had once been second nature to her, but which now felt like a borrowed skin she was wearing for this moment, remembering what it felt like to be seen only when they needed something from her. They took her into a small room, its walls bare except for a single clock that ticked so softly it could only be heard when everything else fell silent. A metal table was bolted to the floor, a single chair on one side, two on the other, and above it, a lamp hung, its light sharp but not warm, illuminating the dull surface of the table until it reflected in the tired brown of her eyes as she sat down, hands resting on her knees, posture upright, waiting. They didn't speak at first. The two men who entered with her, wearing suits that did nothing to hide the military cut of their hair, and the way they moved, watched her with expressions too carefully composed to be anything but masks. One of them placed the emblem on the table between them, its black surface catching the sterile light, its edges defined and clear, as if the symbol itself was immune to the wear of time. The griffin, with its wings spread, clutching the lightning bolts, stared back at her from the table, a silent accusation and a reminder, and she felt the years between herself and the last time she had seen it as both too short and endless. The man on the left, older, with lines at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he narrowed them, leaned forward, folding his hands together on the table as he looked at her. He did not introduce himself, did not offer pleasantries, only allowed the silence to sit heavy in the room until it pushed against the back of her skull like a pressure she was supposed to fill with words. She did not, and so he finally spoke. He asked her how the emblem had come to be in her possession. His voice was measured, low, neither kind nor harsh, but carrying the weight of authority used to obedience. She looked at him, blinking once, then allowed her gaze to drop to the emblem, tracing its lines with her eyes before she lifted her head again. It had been given to her, she told him, many years ago, when the desert was black under a sky thick with stars, when the sand had turned to mud beneath the weight of blood and rain, and the night was alive with the screams of men and the hiss of radios cutting through the darkness. She had not asked for it, had not wanted it, but it had been pressed into her hand by a man whose blood had soaked through her gloves as she tried to hold the pieces of him together while the mortars fell and the air smelled of cordite and sweat and the burning heat of diesel. It was supposed to be a promise, a protection that meant nothing to anyone but those who had lived and bled under its shadow, a sign that she would be allowed to walk away, to bury the things she had seen and done, to live a life beyond the reach of the missions that had carved the woman she became. They listened, the older man and his younger counterpart with sharp eyes and a jaw that clenched too often to be comfortable, and when she finished, the silence fell again, thicker than before, as if her words had added a weight to the air that pressed down on them all. The older man reached out, touching the emblem with a single finger, as if testing its reality, as if expecting it to vanish under his touch, and when it did not, he lifted his eyes to hers once more. He told her that the emblem was not just a relic of a past operation, not just a symbol given to ghosts who were meant to disappear into the silence they had earned. It was, he explained, a key, a marker that unlocked channels deep within the systems she had spent her years trying to avoid, channels that led to places and people who were not supposed to exist, to operations that were never meant to be known, to truths that had been buried under layers of secrecy so thick that even the people who issued the orders forgot them in time. Someone, he told her, had reactivated the system. Someone had begun pulling at the threads that connected the pieces of a unit that had been declared dead, whose members had been scattered, buried, silenced by the promise of anonymity and the threat of erasure. Someone had found a way to use the emblem she had carried without thought in the bottom of her bag, to light a signal that pulled eyes and questions she had spent her life avoiding back to her doorstep. Amara listened, her hands still, her face giving nothing away, though inside her chest she felt the slow, steady drum of fear mixing with something sharper, something like anger, like betrayal, like the cold certainty that no matter how far she had run, the past had never stopped chasing her. She asked him why they had brought her here, why they had pulled her from the safety of her quiet life, the routine that had allowed her to forget, to become small and unnoticed, and he looked at her, his mouth a hard line, his eyes dark with something she could not name. Because, he said, she was still part of it, whether she wanted to be or not. They wanted to know who had contacted her, who had given her the emblem again if she had not taken it out herself, who she had spoken to, what she had seen, what she knew. They wanted to know if she was part of whatever was happening, if she had chosen to return to a life she had sworn to leave behind, if she was willing to stand again in the places where shadows lived and orders were given in whispers and blood. She told them she had done none of those things, that she had lived her life in the small space she had carved out, filing papers and signing forms, eating oatmeal for lunch because it was easy, because it was quiet, because it allowed her to forget. The younger man leaned forward then, his eyes sharp, his mouth twisting as he asked why. If she had done nothing, the emblem had been found in her possession, why it had triggered protocols that should not have existed anymore, why her name had appeared in systems designed to be unreachable. She met his gaze, her own steady, unwavering, and told him she did not know, that the emblem had always been in her bag, tucked away, untouched, that she had kept it not as a tool, but as a reminder, a token of a promise that she would never again have to be the person she had once been. Silence fell again, the ticking of the clock loud in the quiet, the light above them humming as it cast harsh shadows on the walls. The older man leaned back, exhaling slowly, as if the weight of the moment had pressed the air from his lungs, and he looked at her with eyes that had seen too much, that understood too much, and nodded once, slowly. They told her she could leave, for now, but that she would be watched, that she should remain available for further questioning, that her cooperation would be remembered. They took the emblem, sliding it into a small evidence bag, sealing it with a click that echoed in the small room, and, as they stood, she stood with them, her movements careful, deliberate, as she turned and walked toward the door. Outside, the hallway was the same as it had been when she had entered. The walls, gray-green, the lights bright but cold, the cameras turning silently to follow her as she walked. Each step felt heavy, as if the ground was pulling at her feet, reminding her with every movement that the silence she had built around herself was gone, that the quiet life she had lived was a fragile shell that had cracked open, spilling the past into the present with a force she could not control. They led her to a temporary lodging, a room in a building meant for visiting personnel, with a bed that was too firm and sheets that smelled of bleach, a window that looked out onto the runway where planes sat in the darkness, their lights blinking steadily in the night. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting on her knees, her eyes on the window, watching the lights move against the darkness, the slow blink of red and white, the steady movement of vehicles across the tarmac, the distant roar of engines as they came to life. She did not undress, did not remove her boots, only sat there as the minutes ticked by, the clock on the nightstand counting each second with a soft, insistent click that matched the slow beat of her heart. She thought of the emblem, of the man who had pressed it into her hand, of the promises she had made to herself in the aftermath of that night, of the years she had spent trying to become small, invisible, unremarkable. And as she sat there, the darkness pressing against the window, the quiet of the room pressing against her skin, she realized that the past was not done with her, that the silence she had fought to protect was no longer enough, that whatever was coming would not be stopped by her refusal to see it. She closed her eyes, drawing in a slow breath, feeling the air fill her lungs, the weight of it grounding her, reminding her that she was still here, still alive, still capable of standing. When she opened her eyes, the darkness was still there, but so was she, and for the first time in years she allowed herself to feel the quiet spark of the woman she had once been, the one who had not been afraid to act, the one who had not been afraid to fight, the one who had looked into the darkness and moved forward anyway. And in that moment, she understood that the silence she had built around herself was not protection, but a cage, and that the crack in its walls was not a threat, but a chance, if she was willing to take it. Morning came without color, the sky over the base a pale, bruised gray that bled slowly into the windows of the temporary room where Amara sat, still fully dressed, boots planted firmly on the cold tile floor, as if she had not moved at all in the hours since they left her there. The room smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and the stale air of forced silence, and every tick of the small clock beside the bed was a reminder that time continued to move whether she wanted it to or not. She had not slept. She had allowed her body to remain still, to practice the old discipline of conserving energy in the moments before action, but sleep had not come. Only the quiet, oppressive heaviness of memory and the low hum of tension beneath her skin. She stood, stretching her shoulders until they cracked softly, the sound loud in the quiet room. Outside, the runway was waking, lights blinking against the dawn as trucks rolled by and the distant thrum of engines rising to life pulled at something inside her, reminding her of mornings that began in foreign places under the watch of foreign skies, when she had been someone else. Someone who had not hidden from the shape of her own reflection. She caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror, the dark circles under her eyes deepening the lines of her face, the streak of gray at her temple a stark reminder of years lived in the spaces between violence and silence. She touched the glass lightly with her fingers before turning away, pulling on her jacket, checking the placement of her badge, and lifting her bag with practiced ease. They came for her before the sun had fully cleared the edge of the horizon. A quiet knock on the door before it opened, and a man she recognized from her past stood there, looking older, heavier around the eyes, but still carrying the same solid presence that once had meant safety in a world where safety was only a temporary illusion. Jonathan. She had not seen him in a decade, not since the operation that had ended the first part of her life, not since the day they had walked away from the burning wreckage of a mission that had gone wrong in ways no one had dared to write down. She had not expected to see him again, certainly not here, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. The silence between them crowded with the ghosts of memory. "Ready?" he asked, his voice low, roughened by years of shouting commands over gunfire and engine noise, by too many cigarettes, by the weight of everything they did not say. She nodded once, stepping past him into the hallway, the heavy door clicking shut behind her. They walked in silence through the building, past empty conference rooms and offices with frosted glass that glowed softly in the morning light. She could feel the eyes of cameras tracking them as they moved, could feel the subtle tension in Jonathan's posture as they passed uniformed personnel who stepped quickly aside, their eyes darting away. They exited through a side door, stepping into the cold air that carried the scent of fuel and dust. A truck waited at the curb, an unmarked vehicle that hummed quietly, its engine running, the windows tinted dark. Jonathan opened the passenger door and she climbed in without hesitation, settling into the seat, her bag resting on her lap, her hands folded over it as if to keep it from vanishing in the uncertainty that surrounded them. He climbed in beside her, the truck pulling away with a soft growl as they merged onto the access road that curved around the edge of the base, past the tall fences topped with concertina wire, past guard towers where figures watched with rifles slung across their chests. They did not speak for a long time, the hum of the tires on the road and the low rumble of the engine filling the silence that lay between them like a third presence. Amara looked out the window, watching the landscape slide by, the dry scrub and the distant mountains standing dark against the rising light. She felt the tension in her chest like a coiled spring, the anticipation of something she could not yet name pressing at the edges of her calm. She had spent so long hiding from this feeling, from the pulse of readiness that once had been her constant companion, from the part of herself that had known how to move through the world with purpose, with clarity, with the cold comfort of knowing what needed to be done. The truck turned off the main road onto a smaller, rougher path that led toward a set of abandoned hangars, their corrugated metal sides rusted and streaked with old rain, their windows dark, the doors chained shut with heavy locks. The tires crunched over gravel as they pulled to a stop, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. Jonathan turned off the ignition and looked at her, his eyes searching her face for something, perhaps permission, perhaps understanding, before he opened his door and stepped out. She followed, the air colder here, sharper, the silence around them deeper, as if the world itself was holding its breath. They entered through a side door, the lock snapping open under Jonathan's hand, the door creaking as it swung inward. The air inside was heavy with dust, the scent of old oil and metal lingering like a memory, and the floor was littered with scraps of paper and the small detritus left behind by a place long abandoned by official use but not by purpose. At the center of the hangar, a table had been set up, folding legs steady on the cracked concrete, a laptop open, its screen casting a pale glow in the dimness, illuminating the faces of the others who were already there. They looked up as Amara entered, and she saw in their faces the same weariness she felt in her bones, the same quiet readiness, the same history. A woman with a narrow face and hair pulled back in a severe braid, her eyes sharp and watchful. A man with a limp that he tried to hide, his hand resting on the back of a chair, his eyes flicking to the door and back, measuring exits even as he nodded in greeting. Another man, younger, his face shadowed by the brim of his cap, his posture relaxed but his eyes never still, moving from person to person, taking in details, cataloging them. They were, all of them, people who had once belonged to something that no longer existed. People who had been trained to disappear, to become ghosts, to serve a cause that had used them and then erased them when they became inconvenient. Jonathan introduced them by call signs, old names that felt like distant echoes to Amara, labels that once had meant life or death in the field, but now hung in the air like the remnants of a language she no longer spoke. They nodded to her, accepting her presence without question, without ceremony, as if she had always been part of this room, this moment. She placed her bag on the table, unzipping it to remove her notebook, a small gesture grounding her as she looked at the screen, the images there pulling her attention forward. Satellite images, maps marked with colored lines and coded symbols, the outlines of buildings and roads and places she had not thought of in years. A desert, dry and vast, marked by the scars of old conflicts, the lines of rivers that no longer flowed, the shadows of compounds surrounded by fences that were not meant to keep people out, but to keep secrets in. She recognized the terrain, the pattern of the roads, the placement of the outposts that did not exist on any official map, and felt the quiet tightening of her breath as the past rose up to meet her once more. Jonathan explained in a voice that was both professional and weary that something had reactivated the channels used by their old unit, something that was using the call signs and encryption codes that should have been buried with the classified files that had sealed their histories away. He told them that an asset, marked only as the box, had resurfaced in a region that was supposed to be clear, that the codes used to access and move it matched the old systems tied to the emblem that had been found in her possession. He told them that someone was using them, using their past, to move something they did not yet understand, something that had drawn the attention of people with too much power and too little accountability. Amara listened, her eyes on the images on the flickering video feed of the compound they had found. The low walls, the figures moving within, the shadows that passed across the camera's lens. She saw the outlines of people carrying weapons, moving with the discipline of those trained in violence, and saw, in the center of the compound, the shape of a container. Small, dark, unremarkable, but unmistakable in its design, in the way it was guarded, in the way it was placed at the center of everything. She asked what they wanted from her, her voice calm, steady as she looked at Jonathan, her eyes holding his without hesitation. He told her that they needed someone who could move in that space, who could walk unseen where others would be caught, who could find the answers they needed before the people using them closed the doors forever. He told her that they could not force her, that she had earned the right to refuse, that she could walk away and let them handle it, let them carry the weight, let them try to fix what had been broken. Amara looked at the images, at the faces of the people in the room, at the emblem that now lay on the table between them, and felt the weight of all the years she had spent trying to be small, to be invisible, to be nothing. She felt the quiet spark of the woman she had once been, the one who had not been afraid to move, to act, to fight, and she let it rise, let it fill the spaces inside her that had grown empty with years of silence. She nodded once, reaching for the emblem, her fingers closing around it with a finality that felt like the closing of a door, and said that she would go. And in that moment, the room seemed to breathe, the people around the table shifting, the air changing, the old ghosts that had stood behind them for so long stepping forward to join them once more. No longer shadows, but people, ready to move, ready to act, ready to fight for something that had been stolen from them. Outside, the wind stirred the dust around the hangar, the sky above them clearing as the first true light of morning broke across the horizon. And, for the first time in years, Amara felt the silence inside her crack, not with fear, but with purpose, with the quiet, steady certainty that she was ready to reclaim the voice she had given up, to stand where she had once fallen, and to face whatever came next without hesitation. The evening was cold as they prepared in the abandoned hangar, the concrete floor radiating the chill that crept through the soles of their boots and into their bones. Overhead, the wind rattled the rusted siding of the building, the echo carrying across the vast emptiness of the space as Amara moved with quiet efficiency, her hands steady, her movements precise, as she checked each piece of gear laid out before her. The others worked in silence, the air heavy with the unspoken understanding that this was not a mission any of them wanted, but one they could no longer ignore. The laptop on the folding table hummed softly, the screen alive with shifting data, satellite images, coded messages pulsing as lines of text scrolled, the glow lighting their faces with cold blue as they prepared to step back into a world they had all tried to leave behind. Amara lifted the tactical vest, its weight familiar as she pulled it over her shoulders, adjusting the straps until it fit snugly against her body, the Velcro whispering as she sealed it into place. She checked the placement of the tools she would carry, the small blades, the wire, the compact firearm that was not registered to any name that existed in public record. Her hands moved with the calm of practice, the rhythm of preparation filling her mind, pushing away the thoughts that tried to intrude, the memories of why she had chosen to walk away from all of this, the faces of those she had left behind. She did not allow herself the softness of hesitation now, not when the work required her to be clear, to be cold, to be ready. Jonathan stood beside her, his gear already in place, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, watching her with the quiet understanding of a man who knew what it cost to pick up the tools of the past. He handed her a small comm device, the earpiece fitting snugly as she placed it, the wire disappearing beneath the collar of her jacket. She tested it, the soft click of connection humming in her ear as his voice came through, low and steady, asking her if she could hear him. She nodded, giving a quiet affirmative before returning to the last checks of her equipment. The others were ready as well, each carrying their own ghosts, their own reasons for standing here tonight. The woman with the braid adjusted her gloves, the man with the limp checked the sight on his rifle, and the young man with the restless eyes moved around them, checking the battery packs, the spare mags, the small, almost invisible cameras that would capture everything they saw once they moved. They worked with the efficiency of people who had spent their lives in the shadow of missions like this, people who understood that words were unnecessary when the time came to act. The laptop chimed softly, pulling their attention to the map that appeared, the satellite feed updating to show the compound they would enter before dawn, the low walls, the sparse lighting, the movement of figures in the dark that marked the guards, the patrol patterns noted with careful annotations in red. The box was there. The small, unremarkable container that carried with it the weight of their past, the key to whatever was pulling at the threads of their old lives, the reason they were here now, preparing to walk into a place where they were not wanted, to take something back that should never have existed. Amara studied the map, the lines and numbers settling into her mind, building the landscape in her memory as she traced the approach routes, the possible exits, the fallback points if everything went wrong. She felt the quiet calm that came with purpose, the narrowing of the world into the clarity of the mission, the way her mind focused until the weight of the past became nothing more than data, noise that could be ignored as she prepared to move. Jonathan's voice was low as he explained the timing, the window they would have once the patrol rotated to the far side of the compound, the 6 minutes they would have to breach the perimeter, to cross the open ground, to reach the building where the box was kept before the next sweep. She listened, nodding as she absorbed the information, her mind already moving through the steps, the possibilities, the contingencies if they encountered resistance, the paths they would take if they had to run. The others asked brief, precise questions, the answers given in the same efficient cadence, the language of people who understood what was at stake, who knew that hesitation could be fatal. When the plan was clear, when the last details had been checked and double-checked, they fell silent, the weight of what they were about to do settling around them like the cold air of the hangar. They moved out before midnight, the truck loaded with the gear they would need, the lights off as it rolled quietly through the darkness, the only sound the low rumble of the engine and the soft click of weapons being checked one final time. Amara sat in the back, her eyes on the darkness outside the window, the passing shapes of trees and rocks illuminated briefly by the moon before slipping back into shadow. Her heart was steady, her breathing slow, her mind clear as she let herself sink into the rhythm of the moment, the readiness that had once been as familiar to her as breathing. They parked the truck a mile from the compound, the last stretch covered on foot, their movements silent as they moved through the dry brush, the sand shifting softly under their boots. The air was cold, the wind carrying the scent of dust and the faint tang of metal from the distant compound, the glow of the security lights casting long shadows across the ground. They moved in a staggered line, each watching the angles, the spaces between the rocks, the movement of the wind in the sparse grass, each step deliberate, each breath controlled. As they approached the perimeter, Amara felt the shift, the tightening of focus, The way the world seemed to narrow until there was only the sound of her breath, the soft scuff of boots on dirt, the weight of the gear on her shoulders, the faint pulse of her heart in her ears. They paused at the edge of the last cover, the low ridge of a dry wash that gave them a view of the compound, the guards moving in predictable patterns, their weapons slung lazily as they walked the perimeter, unaware of the eyes watching them from the darkness. Jonathan's voice was a whisper in her ear, the signal that it was time, and she moved, rising from her crouch and stepping forward, her body low, her movements smooth as she crossed the open ground, the others moving with her, a silent shadow across the sand. The lights above them cast thin cones that swept slowly across the yard, and they moved in the spaces between, the rhythm of the lights and the patrols dictating their pace, the countdown ticking in her mind with each step. They reached the wall, pressing close to the rough concrete, the texture cold against the back of her hand as she checked the lock on the service door. The small tool slid into place, the quiet click of tumblers shifting before the lock released, the door swinging open a fraction, the darkness inside waiting. She slipped through first, the others following, the door closing silently behind them as they moved into the narrow corridor, the air inside warmer, heavy with the smell of oil and old dust. They moved quickly, each step practiced, the layout of the compound matching the map in her mind as they navigated the halls, avoiding the cameras, the sensors, the small details that marked the presence of security systems meant to stop intruders who did not know where to look. They found the room where the box was kept, a small, reinforced chamber with a single door and a keypad that glowed softly in the darkness. The young man with the restless eyes stepped forward, pulling a small device from his pocket, the screen flickering as he connected it to the keypad, the soft hum of the lock disengaging filling the silence. Amara stepped inside first, her weapon ready, her eyes scanning the room, the shadows deep and heavy around the small, unremarkable case that sat on the table in the center of the room, surrounded by empty chairs, the only witness to its presence, the quiet hum of the generator that powered the lights above. She approached it slowly, her eyes on the edges of the room, on the corners where shadows lingered, before she reached out, her fingers closing around the handle, lifting it from the table, the weight of it solid in her hand, a promise and a threat. They moved quickly then, retracing their steps, the box secured, the hallways empty as they slipped back through the door, across the yard, into the darkness that had carried them in. But as they reached the edge of the compound, the first alarm began to sound, a low, wailing cry that rose into the night, the lights shifting, brightening, the shadows disappearing under the harsh glare as the compound came alive around them. Amara felt the shift, the pulse of adrenaline in her veins, the world narrowing into the single clarity of escape as they ran, their feet pounding the sand, the lights chasing them as the guards began to shout, weapons raised, shots cracking through the darkness. They reached the truck as the first vehicles from the compound roared to life, headlights cutting through the night as they turned onto the path that led away from the compound, the engines screaming as they closed the distance. Jonathan threw the truck into gear, the tires spinning before they caught, the vehicle lurching forward as they sped into the darkness, the box secured between them, the mission completed. But the weight of what they carried now pressing against them with every mile that took them further from the compound and deeper into the unknown. They drove through the night with the box secured between them, its small dark frame wedged against a pack of supplies and the metal of the truck bed clinking lightly with each bump along the dirt roads that cut through the desert. The engine hummed beneath them, the tires kicking up long trails of dust that rose and disappeared into the blackness behind them as if the night itself was swallowing every trace of their passage. Amara sat in the back seat, her eyes on the faint glow of the box under the dim interior lights, the thin red indicator blinking in slow, unhurried pulses like a heartbeat trapped inside a metal shell. She felt each blink like a silent question, each pulse like a reminder that what they had carried away from that compound was not just a piece of hardware, not just evidence of betrayal, but a promise of truth that would either save them or destroy them, depending on how it was used. Jonathan drove with his eyes fixed on the road, the tension in his shoulders clear even through the thick fabric of his jacket, his hands tight on the wheel as the truck bounced and swayed with the uneven ground. The others remained silent, each caught in the private calculations that filled the space between heartbeats when a mission was completed, but the aftermath was yet to come, when the silence was thick with the weight of what they now possessed and what would follow once it was revealed. The young man with restless eyes held a small transmitter in his hand, his thumb tapping it lightly against his thigh as he watched the box, the reflected red light dancing across his face as they drove, his mind calculating signal strength and the pattern of satellite paths as he prepared for what they were about to unleash. They reached the safe house just before dawn, the sky over the mountains bleeding from deep black to a gray so pale it seemed to drain the world of color as they parked the truck in the shadows of a crumbling barn. The wind was cold and dry, carrying the scent of dust and sagebrush, and Amara felt it against her skin as she stepped out, the air biting at the sweat that clung to her neck and the edges of her hair under her cap. She lifted the box from the truck bed, its weight steady and heavy, pressing into her arms and down into her spine as she carried it across the uneven ground towards the building that would serve as their final staging ground before the world changed. Inside, the air was stale but warmer, the thick walls holding the heat from the generator that hummed softly in the corner, providing power to the rows of equipment lined up on folding tables along the walls. Screens flickered to life as they entered, the glow chasing away the darkness, filling the space with shifting data and quiet beeps as systems came online. Jonathan closed the door behind them, barring it with a heavy piece of timber that scraped across the floor, and for a moment they all stood there, the box resting on the table between them, the blinking light casting its steady rhythm across their faces, marking time in a way that felt both urgent and eternal. They moved into position with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this too many times before, the young man connecting cables to the box, his fingers moving quickly over the keyboard as lines of code scrolled down the screen, the progress bar filling in slow increments as the data within the box began to transfer to the secured drives they had prepared. The woman with the braid monitored the signal intercepts, her eyes flicking over the frequencies as she adjusted dials and checked for any sign that their presence had been detected, that the transmission they were preparing to send would be blocked or traced before it could complete. Amara stood back, her arms crossed, the tension in her shoulders a slow-burning coil, as she watched the screens, the images and documents appearing in fragments as the files unpacked, revealing piece by piece the operations they had all once been part of, the missions that had been erased from official memory, the orders given in whispers that had led to actions none of them could fully forget. She saw the photographs first, grainy images captured by drones and helmet cameras, flashes of gunfire in dark alleys, the outlines of figures dragging bodies through the dust, the close-up of a face that had once belonged to a child, eyes open and unblinking under a night sky. Reports followed, written in the cold, detached language of military precision, describing targets neutralized, objectives completed, collateral contained. She felt the room close around her as the images and words layered over each other, the memories they triggered rising like ghosts she could not push away, the sound of gunfire echoing in her ears, the weight of a rifle against her shoulder, the screams she had learned to ignore for the sake of the mission. She closed her eyes, drawing in a breath that tasted of dust and electricity, holding it until the shaking in her hands stilled, until she could open her eyes again and see the screens not as a collection of wounds reopened, but as evidence of what they had survived, of what they would no longer allow to remain hidden. The progress bar on the transmission terminal reached its end, the small chime ringing softly as the files finished their transfer, the last document opening on the screen, a list of names and dates, operations that had never existed on paper until now, missions signed with call signs and initials, names like hers, like Jonathan's, like those who were no longer alive to see what they had been part of. The young man looked up, his eyes meeting hers, a question in them that needed no words, and she nodded once, the decision made not in that moment, but in every moment that had led them here, in every decision to remain silent, to accept the erasure of their history, to pretend that silence was the same as peace. He pressed the key that began the transmission, the files flowing through encrypted channels, bouncing between satellites and servers they had prepared, spreading into the networks where they would be found, where they would be seen, where they would become undeniable. The screens flickered as the confirmation signals returned, the small green lights blinking in sequence as the data moved, unstoppable now, the truth slipping through the cracks of the system that had once hidden it, becoming a tide that would reach every place that mattered. Outside, the dawn was breaking, the light creeping across the dirt and into the cracks of the barn as the wind rose, carrying with it the scent of the coming heat, the promise of a day that would begin with the world changed by what they had done. The woman with the braid turned off the monitoring equipment, the screens going dark one by one, leaving only the soft hum of the generator and the sound of the wind against the walls. Jonathan leaned against the table, his head bowed, his hands resting on the edge as he breathed out, the tension leaving his body in a slow wave as the weight of what they had carried, what they had unleashed, settled around them. Amara stepped forward, her eyes on the small indicator on the box, the red light now steady, unblinking, marking the completion of the transmission, the end of the silence they had lived within for so long. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the metal, feeling its cold certainty, its promise that what they had done would not be forgotten, that the voices of those who had been erased would now be heard, even if it came at the cost of the fragile quiet they had built for themselves. She closed her hand around the handle, lifting the box, feeling its weight one last time before she set it aside, the final act of letting go. They sat together in the quiet as the light grew, each of them caught in their thoughts, in the memory of what had been and the uncertainty of what would come. The silence now a different thing, no longer the hush of secrets kept, but the calm after a storm. The breath held in the moment before the world realized what had changed. Amara looked at each of them, seeing in their eyes the same mix of relief and fear, of hope and grief, knowing that they could not take back what they had done, knowing that they would not want to, even if they could. The young man with restless eyes stood first, moving to the door, pulling it open to let the dawn in, the cold air washing through the room as he stepped outside, the light catching on his face, turning his expression into something calm, something almost at peace. The woman with the braid followed, her hand resting briefly on Amara's shoulder as she passed. the touch light but grounding, a thank you that needed no words. Jonathan stayed for a moment longer, his eyes on the floor before he lifted them to meet hers, and in that look she saw the acknowledgement of everything they had been, everything they had lost, and everything they had chosen to become. When he finally stepped outside, Amara remained for a moment, standing in the empty room as the light spilled across the floor, the dust rising in the warmth of the morning as she drew in a breath and let it out, steady and calm. She walked to the door, pausing at the threshold to look back at the empty space, at the place where they had ended their silence, where they had chosen to be seen, to let their voices echo through the systems that had once erased them. Then she stepped out into the dawn, the sun rising over the desert, the wind lifting her hair from her face as she walked forward, the quiet around her filled now with the promise that they would no longer be silent, that the world would hear them, that the truth, once freed, could never again be hidden. The world did not end with sirens or the sharp report of gunfire echoing over rooftops. It did not end with the sudden silence of power being cut or the darkness of blacked-out streets. It ended quietly, the same way dawn arrived, touching each place with light until there was nowhere left for the shadows to hide. When the files finished spreading, the archive unspooling itself across secure networks and dark channels, it happened without the drama Amara had imagined in the quiet moments before sleep when she wondered if the world would shake when the truth was finally known. Instead, it came as a red notification light on monitors in quiet offices, as encrypted files landing in the inboxes of journalists and inspectors who had stopped believing they would ever see such proof as lines of code that bypassed firewalls and barriers, replacing the hush of secrets with the undeniable voice of memory made permanent. In the days that followed, the news cycled from confusion to panic to cold, measured analysis. The images and reports they had sent out, the lists of names and missions, the photographs and video snippets that had lived only in the shadows of locked rooms, began to appear in fragments on screens around the world. Commentators debated the validity, governments issued statements of denial, and the public watched as a different kind of fear crept into the voices of men who had once spoken with the certainty of power. It was not a revolution that broke the system overnight, but a change in the weight of silence, an awareness that the things whispered about in hallways had been real, that the ghosts who had carried out missions in the dark were not faceless after all, and that the world they lived in was smaller and more fragile than they had believed. Amara watched it unfold in small moments, not from the safety of a command center, but from the window of a small room above a street in a city that did not know her name. She had moved again, quietly, as she always had, packing what she could carry in a single bag, leaving behind the abandoned safe house and the others who had chosen their own paths in the wake of what they had released. The apartment was sparse, a single bed pushed against the wall, a table with a chair, and a small kitchenette that smelled of strong coffee and the faint, persistent trace of cleaning products. It was enough. She did not need more. Outside the window, people moved as they always did, carrying groceries, talking on their phones, children laughing as they skipped ahead of parents who called them back to sidewalks, the small moments of life continuing even as the undercurrent of fear touched the edges of conversations. She heard it in the way people lowered their voices on buses, in the way neighbors lingered in doorways to speak in cautious tones, in the way the news flickered across televisions and cafes, the volume turned down, but the headlines visible enough to remind everyone that something had shifted. She sat by the window in the mornings with a cup of coffee warm in her hands, watching as the world adjusted to the truths it had tried to bury. They could not erase what had been seen, not now, not completely. There were attempts, of course. Files vanished from public servers, officials claimed the data had been manipulated, and spokespeople called for calm as they insisted the documents were out of context, misunderstood. But the images were there, the names were there, and for every door that tried to close, a dozen more opened, voices rising where there had once been only silence. Amara knew better than to think it would change everything. Systems did not fall because of a single revelation, no matter how loud, no matter how undeniable. Power protected itself, shifting to accommodate the new reality, smoothing over the edges of scandal with investigations that moved too slowly, with panels and commissions that issued reports years too late. But it was enough that it was seen. Enough that the silence was gone. Enough that the world now understood the ghosts who moved through it, the missions that were never acknowledged, the lives that were spent in darkness so others could live in comfortable ignorance. In the quiet of her new space, she found a different kind of peace, not the fragile, suffocating stillness of hiding, but the calm of knowing she had done what needed to be done, that she had not left her voice buried with the past. The nightmares still came, of course, as they always had, images of fire and the heavy smell of blood, the screams that pierced the dark, the helplessness of moments when she had been too slow, too late. But there was something different now, a softness at the edges of those memories, a knowledge that she had refused to remain silent, that she had not allowed those who died to be forgotten, their lives reduced to whispers in back rooms. She walked the streets without fear, moving through markets where the smell of fruit and spices mingled with the warm exhaust of passing cars, where the calls of street vendors rose in the afternoon heat, where children chased each other under the awnings of shops. She moved without the weight of constant caution, no longer avoiding the eyes of those around her, no longer shrinking into herself when uniforms passed by, no longer carrying the reflex to scan for exits with every step. It was not freedom, not in the pure sense of the word, but it was something closer than she had ever allowed herself to feel. Sometimes at night, she would take out the small metal emblem, the black griffin etched into its surface, its wings spread as it held the lightning bolts in its claws, the symbol that had once marked her for erasure and now marked her for something else entirely. She would hold it in her palm, feeling the cool weight of it against her skin, the memory of what it meant and the promise it had kept. She did not hide it away now, did not bury it in the bottom of her bag, did not fear what it would bring. It was part of her, as much as the scars on her arms, as much as the silver in her hair, as much as the calm strength in her gaze when she looked at herself in the mirror in the mornings. The world moved on, as it always did, but it moved differently now. She saw it in the hesitation of officers who pulled over drivers, in the way reporters asked questions they would have been too afraid to ask before, in the way people looked at the men in suits who once moved without fear, who now flinched when someone mentioned the files. The world did not crumble, but it learned to see its cracks, and for Amara, that was enough. She did not need justice, not in the way others demanded it, with trials and verdicts and sentences handed down by people who did not understand the weight of what had been done. For her, the truth was justice enough, the voice of memory echoing in spaces where silence had once reigned. 3 weeks after the files were released, Amara stood at a bus stop in the early morning, the cold biting at her fingers, the breath of the city rising around her in small, white clouds. She watched as people waited with her, their faces tired but calm, their eyes reflecting the glow of the street lights that had not yet switched off, the buses arriving and departing with the steady rhythm of a world that kept moving, no matter what it had learned. She climbed aboard when her bus arrived, finding a seat near the window, the vibration of the engine humming through her bones as the city began to wake around her. She carried with her a small notebook, its pages filled with the quiet observations of days spent watching the world, of conversations overheard, of names and places she wanted to remember, of small moments that mattered in ways no mission ever had. She carried with her the memory of those she had lost, of those who had been erased, of those who had fought beside her in places that no longer existed, in missions that had once been denied but were now laid bare for all to see. She carried with her the promise she had made to herself that she would not be silent again, that she would live in the open, that she would let herself exist in a world that had tried to erase her. As the bus moved through the city, past parks where the first light of dawn touched the frost on the grass, past the rows of small shops opening their doors, past the quiet neighborhoods where people were just beginning to rise from their beds, Amara felt a peace she had never allowed herself before. It was not the peace of forgetting, not the quiet of erasure, but the peace of being seen, of being known, of having spoken when it mattered most. She pressed her hand against the window, feeling the cold glass against her palm, watching the world move outside, alive with the promise of another day. She smiled, a small, quiet smile that was hers alone, and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of that peace fill her, letting the memory of the storm they had unleashed settle into a calm that lived beneath her skin. She would carry it always, the knowledge of what they had done, the truth they had shared, the voices they had freed. And as the bus rolled on, the city waking around her, Amara Hill moved forward, not as a ghost in the silence, but as a consequence the world would never again be able to ignore. If you found this story worth hearing, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Check out the other stories on the channel, and if you think someone needs to hear this, share the video. Thank you for watching.